Here we are, AP Biology, Chapter 17. We're going to be focusing on the evolution of plants, and this is video 2, so we'll be focusing on gymnosperms and angiosperms. So previously we talked about how plants made the shift from the water to land. We talked about the alteration of generations, mosses, and we talked about ferns. What we're going to be focusing on today are those gymnosperms and angiosperms, and these are plants that make seeds. And so there's two things that they have is they have pollen grain as a way of transporting their sperm, because up until this point the sperm has been flagellated as a way of having mobility only in a water environment, and they have a way of protecting their embryos inside seeds. When we look at fruit, we actually can see its function as being used for seed dispersal. And some of the ways that fruit is dispersed, or the way that we disperse seeds, is that they actually will have wing-like structures on them that allow them to be carried on the wind. So this is an example. Or they'll actually have seeds that have like prickly things on them, or some sort of snare that allows them to get caught in an animal's fur so that they then get transported on the backs of the animal. Or they make themselves taste so sweet that animals will actually eat them, digest, and the seed will come out in that animal's poop. Now, when we talk about the plants that have seeds, we're talking about gymnosperms. These are the earliest ones. These are your pine cone trees, or your pine trees. And the reason why they're called gymnosperms is because they have a naked seed. Their seeds are actually found in the cones, hence there's pine cones. Now, a pine tree is actually the sporophyte generation. So it's this ginormous structure that can be hundreds of feet tall that is actually the sporophyte generation. On that sporophyte generation, you'll actually see the gametophyte. The gametophyte is inside of the pine cones. Now, the sperm is in that pollen grain, and it actually looks like the little yellow dusting that is found on pine trees, and we'll see them kind of as we go further. And what they do is they fertilize the egg that is actually found inside the pine cone. Then you have a zygote develop because the sperm and the egg come together. That zygote will then develop into another sporophyte, and that sporophyte will grow up to be the ginormous tree. Now, with that being said, we can look here at the life cycle of a pine tree. And if we look at the overall structure of it, we're going to see that most of it is in the sporophyte generation. So here is our sperm and egg. So here's our egg, here's our sperm, and they're coming together to form a zygote. Once we have our haploid sperm and egg turn into a diploid zygote, that zygote will then grow. Now this brown structure is actually part of a pine cone. So this zygote is developing inside of a pine cone. It's growing and developing through mitosis, and then eventually it becomes its own little sapling or tiny little baby tree. Now this sporophyte will actually grow up to become the ginormous pine tree as we know them, and that's the sporophyte generation. Within this sporophyte generation, you'll have the visible pine cones, and then this little feathery structure with the yellow, those are the pollen grain. And these are inside of this is your gametophyte generation. Very tiny, but there's your sperm, and there's going to be your egg that'll be produced through meiosis. How did we make the gametophyte generation? By going from diploid, going through meiosis to become haploid. Now, angiosperms, on the other hand, these flowering plants, have actually developed a way of protecting the zygote even more by having these protective ovaries, and the ovaries contain the eggs. So the main piece of an angiosperm is the flower. And when we look at the parts of a flower, what we have is sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. And so we can see that a stamen is actually made up of the anther and filament. So this little stick and this bulbous part at the top. This is both part. This is the filament. This is the anther. This is part of a stamen. And the stamen is where you find the semen. So it's the male reproductive structures. Whereas within the flower at the very center is this kind of bulbous part. That's the green. This up here is our sticky little stigma. The stick part is the style. And then down here, of course, is our ovary. And inside of our ovary, we have our eggs. Now, The stigma, style, and ovary are all combined into what we call the carpel, and that's the female reproductive structures. We will actually be dissecting a lily flower to look at and see these flower parts. Now, the angiosperm plant, so the flowering plants, is actually a sporophyte, and the gametophyte is inside of its flowers. So inside of the angiosperm life cycle, the ovule, so if we go back, these are the ovules, these little structures inside of our ovary. They turn into the seeds, whereas the ovary itself is what becomes the flowers. So here's our life cycle of an angiosperm. Once again, we're going to start with our pollen grain, which contains our sperm, our ovule, which contains our egg. We're going to have our sperm and egg come together. So the sperm literally grows down and injects its nucleus into the egg. And then we have fertilization and we have a zygote. The zygote is diploid. It's going to reproduce through mitosis, where it's going to turn into the seed, protected by a seed coat. Now what happens is this is going to turn into our fruit. And that a fruit is simply the mature ovary with seeds inside of it. Now what happens is that when this germinates, this will turn into your flower. Your flower will then bloom, reproduce, producing the male and female reproductive parts, which then go through meiosis to make the pollen and the egg so that we can have fertilization happen once again. And that's the life cycle of an angiosperm. Now, one of the big things about this is that we should care a lot about plants, not only because they're pretty, but because they're our main food source, right? They are what provide most of the food that we use for most of our commercial products. And so those are actually angiosperms that we're eating. Now, angiosperms are also a major source of food, not only for humans, but for all other animals. And so what happens is that they have developed a way, angiosperms have developed a way of using the animals to help pollinate or to help cross-pollinate, so to spread the sperm of one flower onto the egg of another. And so if you've ever looked at a bumblebee, its tail is covered in little hairs that are covered in pollen. What is pollen? But sperm from one flower. And so when they go and travel to a different flower, they then deposit that sperm on the sticky stigma, and that allows it to grow down and fertilize an egg of another flower. Hummingbirds have those really long, skinny beaks. Why is that? So that they can reach in and get the nectar. The nectar is nothing more than a way of attracting pollinators so that they'll pick up the little pollen grains off of the flower and deposit it on another flower. The same thing can be said with those big cactus flowers. Those are actually fertilized by bats. Now, one of the big things that we need to recognize is the connection between angiosperms and the environment, because plants are a non-renewable resource. So many of our forests are being destroyed worldwide for farming or for agriculture or to make room for more cities and more people. But in doing that, we're killing the exact crops that we need to sustain us. So it's something to think about. And then some of the plants that they have discovered are actually used for medicine. So some of them can help prevent malaria, some of them are used in cancer treatment drugs, some of them are used as leukemia treatment drugs, some of them are used to help treat heart disease, some of them can cure coughs. So there's a lot of different things that plants can do that help. Now, I'm going to talk about fungus or fungi as a separate lecture. So we'll finish here.